All right, so now I've asked to pair my talk about exclusion with the kind of a telling of the Japanese American community on the South Side. I've asked 3 panelists. I've asked them all to introduce themselves with an opening statement, but the panelists are Hannah Hogan, who is also my grandmother. I'm very happy she's here. Thank you. Ross Harano. And Mariko Ventura.
Okay. Chicago's South Side communities of Woodlawn and Hyde Park from January 1946 to 1960 were home base for me and my family. Meaningful issues I'm going to discuss is housing, jobs, school, and violence. On housing, in August 1945, family members relocated to Chicago from Amachi, where they were confined in 1942. May 1943, I was rendered a tuition scholarship to complete my education at Baker University in Baldwin City, Kansas, affiliated with the Methodist Church. Baker welcomed me as well as 6 other Nikkei students with kindness. I am grateful for their trust in us without suspicion during the time of crisis. Previous to Baker's acceptance, 4 or more colleges denied admission to my request. When I first approached the building where my family resided, I was dismayed. The imposing 1893 Columbian exposition structure was in a deplorable condition. A rental on the 2nd floor shared a gritty bathroom at the end of the hall with 4 other families. The apartment was for one family, now subdivided into 4 kitchenette abodes. Fast forward to 1952, a fire, arson. Our limited belongings stored on our cots in the scant 2-bedroom setting disappear in flames. I seek housing at a Hyde Park realtor. I'm so sorry, but this owner will not rent to your family, she remarked sadly. Disheartened, I seek other references to no avail. Then I hear of a rental available at Mr. Matsunaga's building. His daughter, Setsuko, was one of the first Nikkei deemed inadvisable at the University of Chicago campus in 1942. Several more moves as the family dynamics changed. Finally, more desirable university housing becomes available to me. On jobs, what a disappointment when I am informed that the Kansas Teacher's Certificate does not meet the standards for the Chicago schools. A Loop agency advisor comments glumly, "You'll do better in Wisconsin." Chicago markets are open for Japanese American community. To meet my personal and career needs, nights and days are filled with part-time secretarial positions, classes at Teachers College, at the University of Chicago Education Department, and later I was awarded an awesome tuition scholarship from the Institute for Psychoanalysis Child Care Program. At the university here, under the guidance of Olga Adams, director of the kindergarten, I attained the utmost firsthand practical experience teaching gifted youngsters. This position led to a wide range of work with children in separate settings. I gained the goal for placement in the Chicago schools as a kindergarten teacher at Christopher School, Special Education. The staff is extremely dedicated, cheerful, and tireless educators. In contrast, the demeanor of the Central Administration Office in Chicago lacked simple courtesies toward eager applicants. Schools, at that time, overcrowded. Do you know about double shifts? Mobile classrooms on every playground, parking sites, and in my school, on the auditorium stage. This was an assignment as a temporary teacher in grade 1, was quite a letdown. I'd like to speak about violence at that time in Chicago. I voiced my opinion to the city recommending condemnation of the 62nd Street structure where we lived. A Nikkei lawyer investigates, reports, no clear response. As for assaults and robberies, my mother's purse is snatched on a shopping trip. 2 middle-year boys knock her down on the cement sidewalk. A tenant is mugged in the doorway just after my entrance before him up the steps. I'm not prejudiced, but I'm moving, he shouts to me. Again, I contact the mayor's office regarding crime in the area. An officer visits, suggests politely, if unhappy, just move. In closing, this is a unique community. The gifts afforded to me by thoughtful and compassionate citizens outweighs the adverse conditions we experienced in the past era. And lastly, go White Sox.
I like the White Sox comment.
Okay, good.
I'm a South Sider by heart, even though I live on the North Side. And I come from a mixed marriage. My wife is a Cubs fan. I was born in 1942 behind barbed wire in Fresno, the fairgrounds there. And when I was 1 month old, we were shipped to Arkansas, Jerome, Arkansas. In 1943, my father had a job in Alton, Illinois. He was able to get a job in a greenhouse. So we stayed there for a year, and we came to Chicago in 1944, and we couldn't find a place to live, according to my mother. Every time they would go to a place, they couldn't, the place was always filled. Vacancy, then no vacancy. People were not renting to Japanese Americans in those days. So we lived in Humboldt Park, and my mother said it was the first time she came across bed bugs. And my father had to get a sulfur candle and get rid of the bed bugs. Finally, in 1945, we were able to pool the money and buy a house on 4201 South Oakenwall at the big price of $3,000. I was very fortunate that it was a big enough place because my mother's 3 sisters, 2 brothers, and grandparents lived there with us. We had 14 people living there, plus children. So it was a very crowded, I think we ate in 2 shifts, but it was the greatest time of my life because I had all my relatives with me. Most of them then moved back to California in 1948 to 1950. Of the family, what happened was that as my uncles, I had 7 uncles in World War II, 4 served in Europe in the 442, and 3 served in military intelligence in the Pacific. As they came back from the war, that's when they moved in with us. That's why we had so many families living in that house. On my mother's side, of the 4 that served, 1 was wounded at Anzio and didn't get out of the hospital till 1946. Others served as interpreters in the military intelligence on the front lines in New Guinea, and later served in terms of the occupation of Japan. On my father's side, I had 2 uncles who served in World War II in the 442, and 1 was killed in France rescuing the Lost Texas Battalion. I graduated from Oakville Grammar School in 1956 and attended Hyde Park High School, which was at that time the only integrated high school in the city because of the gerrymandering that took place for the high school boundaries. So it was the first time that I met other folks than my friends from grammar school and my friends at church. It was the first time I ever had Jewish friends too, by the way. So Hyde Park to me was an amazing school at the time. We have other graduates here who graduated with me. And it was a great experience because not only did I meet other Sansei, 3rd generation, but also met other folks that weren't Japanese. My primary interaction with the Japanese American community was at Kenwood Ellis Community Church on 46th and Greenwood, which was a merger of the Kenwood Ellis Church and the Kenwood Church, the Ellis Church and the Kenwood Church. So it was Japanese American and African American. It was a great church to belong to. I was in the choir, 2 years of confirmation, learned a lot, which I've forgotten. And my grandfather, in terms of the University of Chicago, I discovered I had 3 relationships with this university. The first was my Auntie Ume, who married my Uncle Sus at Rockefeller Chapel when he got out of military intelligence. The second, I found out later, was my grandfather worked at the Quadrangle Club at the University of Chicago as a gardener. And her first name was Rihachi. I always thought his name was Richard. But they're calling him Harry. And I said, who's Harry? It turns out to be my uncle. And the third, which I discovered through Eric's help, was my uncle Tom Shibatani, Tommaso Shibatani, who was one of the first 2 enrolled here at the University of Chicago. I knew he was here because I remember visiting him as a kid, but I never knew of the story behind it. So Eric gave me all the files on it. It was very interesting to learn how my uncle became one of the first 2 Japanese Americans or Nisei to attend the University of Chicago. So I'm very grateful for that. And I'm sharing that with the Harano clan, which we have a reunion every 2 years. And we have about 100 plus people show up. So I'll be sharing the story with all my cousins at the reunion, which will take place in Denver this summer. So that's my association with the University of Chicago, and also in terms of growing up on the south side of Chicago.
The history of how my family came to live in Hyde Park and our involvement with the Japanese and Japanese American community is, as a community, we helped each other get through our struggles in post-World War II America. And here is our story. I was born in Kyoto during the American occupation of Japan of a Jewish American father, Charles Ventura, who was from a dry goods business family on Chicago's southwest side. My paternal grandparents came to the United States fleeing fascism in Europe after World War I. My Japanese mother, Teroko Fujiki, was from Kyoto, from a textile artisan family, had experienced the ravages of World War II in Japan. My father was a U.S. Army enlisted man stationed in Kyoto, and because he wanted to bring my mother and I to America, he went through extensive legal challenges to keep our families together. In fact, we had to get permission to marry from the U.S. government. Permission to marry and to bring us here. And I was reminded about this permission from the U.S. military, which is so relevant in our stories. Because of his efforts, we were one of the first U.S. military families allowed to leave Japan intact during the occupation. After arriving in America, we resided on the south side Chicago community of Kenwood. In the early 50s, this neighborhood had a high concentration of Japanese and Japanese Americans. We lived right down the street here at 4958 South Blackstone from 54 to 56 in a building across the street from Kenwood Grade School. Today it's Miriam G. Cantor Middle School. The brick apartment rental units were operated by Mr. and Mrs. Tanaka. From what I can recall, she was Nisei and he may have been Issei. I remember that Mr. Tanaka spoke only Japanese, and before I grasped English, it was comforting to hear him speak the language of my birth. The culturally diverse residents of this building was a microcosm of what Hyde Park and the university community looked like at that time. Amongst the diversity were Japanese Americans who were recently released from internment camps, far from their West Coast properties, Japanese war brides, Japanese American students attending University of Chicago, African American, families from Appalachia, Native Americans, and Puerto Rican and other islanders. We all lived in the same building. I'm not sure if the...
Yes. Sir.
Yeah.
Yes. Downstairs.
Yes. Okay. So that was on the corner of Blackstone. That was on the corner of Blackstone and 55th Street. And it's across the street from that, I think, Kenwood Academy now. So that was the way it looked. Okay. So we looked after each other, even despite some of our cultural differences. We shopped at Fuji Grocery Store till they moved to the north side, then Franklin Food Store. And I remember they were from Hawaii and Americanized their name. Franklin Food Store was in Hyde Park well into the 70s. My parents would travel there from the far north suburbs before Mitsuo was built in the northwest suburb of Arlington Heights. And therefore, before tofu became an American household staple. Yes. We lived in the Kenwood neighborhood of Hyde Park in the early 50s because my mom and I were newly arrived Japanese-speaking Army dependents. The U.S. Fifth Army headquarters was a few blocks away, and the Korean War was just winding down. My father was about to be assigned on a tour of duty to Korea, and his concern was for his wife and daughter to be around the culture and language we just left behind in Kyoto. He apparently did his homework and found the community we would call home until his return from the Korean War. Sadly, he had to leave us for his tour 1 week after my brother Junior was born. I was in kindergarten and didn't speak English, but at that age was able to learn quickly and came home to help my mother along with her own English. The community of Japanese helped each other. I know this through the connections my mom made. For example, friends in the neighborhood would translate my dad's letters for my mother into Japanese from English, and she dictated letters back to him in Japanese to be translated by them to English to send off to my dad. Many of these families were displaced because of their incarceration, but yet they worked hard to make enough money to get back to their property and reunite with their families and family members on the West Coast. Some names are etched in my mind: Kawagoi, Morihara, and Kato. Then there was the Japanese War Brides Club. Many war brides lived in our building and nearby apartments. Many of them were also left to fend for themselves because their American husbands were also ordered by the military to serve far away from their wives. This club functioned as their own support system. I would accompany my mom to their meetings at the Buddhist temple on Dorchester Avenue, which later moved to the north side. One of my vivid memories was when the War Brides Club put on a cavalcade of Japanese performance. I remember attending rehearsals, and among the acts were a Japanese classical dance artist who performed, a sami-san performance, and an American husband who performed, did a stand-up comedy routine about his struggles to speak proper Japanese. I ran around the backstage with a newly found friend as my mother sat in as a greeter. The Tanakas were not just landlords. They functioned as proprietors of a informal community center. Whoops, one more page. They may have had the only telephone available to their Japanese tenants. During my dad's tour of duty, he was given a rest and relaxation break in Kyoto. One early morning, he and my grandmother arranged to call long distance from Japan, and we spoke with them. Tanaka-san also hosted a Japanese feast, and I remember as a 6-year-old marveling at the low table beautifully set with Japanese food, and how I longed to be back in Kyoto with my Oba-san. We were a community who helped each other with generosity and camaraderie in the neighborhood surrounding the University of Chicago in the post-World War years of Hyde Park.
All right, thank you so much for those introductory statements. Based on where we're running on time, I'm going to ask each panelist one question, and then we will break for the reception, but we'll all be sticking around, so if you have any questions, feel free to come up and talk after the event. I want to mention this now before I forget, but part of my research and work on campus here will relate to the University of Chicago Reparations Summit, which is on Friday, April 26th and Saturday, April 27th. So I don't have any flyers for that, but just keep an eye out for that if you're interested in kind of exploring history and dialogue with the present. So I want to ask, I'll just ask down the table one question, but I I think I kind of want to, from all of your remarks, I kind of want to ask a question based on the general idea of strength and diversity, or how strong communities improved your life. So, Hannah, I think could you speak a little bit to the neighborhood you lived in Los Angeles before the war and the neighborhood you lived after the war, and how community how the strength of community helped your family adapt to those neighborhoods?
In Los Angeles, I lived in Southwest area. If you're familiar with University of Southern California, that neighborhood was primarily Japanese Americans and African Americans, and it probably due to restricted covenants. When we first arrived there, most of the community of the African Americans were more affluent. They had been there since probably the 1900s, and they were homeowners. And the first person who was our neighbor was African American lady, and she really taught us what the American dream was. I'd never seen a home furnished and with real appliances, and she taught us about food. I love all kinds of Southern food and barbecue, and she taught my sister how to play bridge, and would take us on trips with her Model A Ford. So it was a very, very, I think, a stable community, and the Japanese Americans, I don't remember of any kind of dissension or whatever, and my school mates were Japanese American and African American, and of course when we went to school it was Caucasian population also, and it was quite stable. And when the war came, it was such a surprise. And compared, you asked about coming into Woodlawn, it was not, there weren't any, I can't remember African Americans on our block. We lived on 62nd and Dorchester, and I think it was just before the white flight, and so we were just so concerned with trying to live, as I mentioned, that there wasn't that much community interaction with us. We're all working or going to school or whatever. So it was quite a different contrast than my initial experience in at Los Angeles. So, yeah.
Thank you. So Ross, I'm going to ask you the same question, but focusing on, I know you mentioned your experience in high school, so the sense of, did diverse communities in high school or at your church bring strength to your family?
Growing up in Oakawall, it was a middle-class street, mainly homes, and most of my friends were white, ethnically German. And in 1953, you have to remember, Cottage Grove in those days was a dividing line between white and black. African Americans could not live east of Cottage Grove. In 1953, that changed, and because of the illegal block busing tactics that were used, my neighborhood changed over the summer. So all of my friends were white, ended up moving to Oak Lawn. That's was just being built up as farmland then. They were just building their own homes there. And by the time the fall came around, my whole neighborhood had changed. And my best buddy before was Ernie Knapp. He was my best buddy. Afterwards, it was Eddie Moore, who was 6'3", was my bodyguard. He and I were at Oakawall Grammar School together, and he also attended Hyde Park. So the neighborhood changed overnight. I never thought about being Japanese. I never thought about it at all. In fact, I didn't even think about it until the day I graduated from Oakawall Grammar School. We went to the Roosevelt Theater to watch the movie about Billy Mitchell. Billy Mitchell, who was the general that predicted air power. And the court martial of Billy Mitchell, you know, Gary Cooper played Billy Mitchell, and Rod Steiger played the attorney, prosecuting attorney, and they're talking about air warfare and talks about Pearl Harbor. Billy Mitchell mentions Pearl Harbor. So then Steiger goes after him and says, well, who would bomb Pearl Harbor? And the general says, Gary Cooper says, the Japanese. Well, all my friends, I just graduated from grammar school, were with me, and they all turned around and looked at me. So I guess at that point I realized that I was Japanese. But our neighborhood was great. Our church was very, very mixed in terms of Japanese Americans and African Americans, and I was very fortunate to have that experience. And Hyde Park High School was a great experience for me also because of the integrated nature of the school and the fact that it was one of the best schools, if not the best, in Chicago at the time. I'm very proud of that. Us were Hyde Parkers first, and the only reason we left the South Side is because they tore down our neighborhood in 1961 to build some projects, so we moved to Uptown. And that's why I'm still a White Sox fan at heart, and one of these days we will win the World Series again.
Okay. Well, our history here, my dad was the military in the U.S. Army, and he was stationed here at Fifth Army headquarters. So what would happen is I went to actually 3 grade schools here in Hyde Park. I went to Kenwood, I went to Kosminski, and then I went to Bret Harte, and then we were off to, that was by then the Cold War. It was in 1960, so we were sent to Anchorage, Alaska, you know, closer to the Russians, and the missiles were, there. But anyways, but all 3 of those schools, and we moved because I think every time the rent would go up, my dad would have to move us because we couldn't afford the rent, so then we would go to another neighborhood. And unbeknownst to my parents, who didn't pay that much attention, well, then you had to go to a different school because I think the blocks, you know, if you crossed a certain street, you went to a different grade school. But all in all, it was wonderful, I have to say. The diversity, and I don't remember any racist comments. Everyone really did truly get along. And I think it helped me in my whole focus of, I became a teacher because I think the education background I got here, and I think some of the teachers even came from the lab school here from the University of Chicago. But from that, I just remember some of my teaching methods even came from way back when. Some of the wonderful educators that you have here in this community. So I can say that it was really, really a good experience for me, a wonderful life affirming experience.
All right, well, with that, do you want to say anything, or we'll just wrap? Yeah. No. All right, well, with that, we're just going to do a reception. Thank you to all of our panelists for coming.